speaking to people struggling with addiction, they shared with me that it's the stigma around addiction that prevents them from admitting they have a problem in the first place and seeking help. So how do we remove, I guess, as a society, the stigma around the word addiction? Hello and welcome to Virtually Anything Goes podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Professor Derek Heim, who's a professor of psychology at Edge Hill University in England, specialising in the area of addiction and has published a variety of papers on this topic too. Professor Heim is also the editor-in-chief for the Addiction Research and Theory Journal, a cross-disciplinary journal that publishes articles on the psychological, social, economic, epidemiologic, and medical and other aspects of addictive behaviour. And if that wasn't enough, Professor Heim is also chair of the board at the charity UK Smart Recovery. UK Smart Recovery empowers people with practical skills, tools and support so that they may manage their addictive behaviour and lead satisfying and meaningful lives. Professor Heim, very warm welcome to the podcast. I'm delighted you could join me.
Well, thanks for having me, and please call me Derek. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. If this is your first time listening to the Virtually Anything Goes podcast, stick around until the very end when I turn control over to Professor Heim, to Derek, and he can ask me his Virtually Anything Goes question. This can be any question at all, but I won't know what it is until Derek asks me the question. So it could literally virtually be about anything. The only caveat is that once I've given my answer, Derek will also have to answer the same question. So Derek, allow me to open with this question. Can the battle against addiction be won either on an individual level or on a societal scale?
Well, I think the battle of addiction is going to be with us. It's an intractable human problem, really. That, life tends to throw things at people that people struggle to deal with and to cope with. And so it depends what you mean by winning the battle of addiction. If you think we're going to, cure addiction once and for all, and people will never ever struggle with addiction, I think the answer is probably no. But I do think we can, deal better with addiction. Our response as a society to addiction problems can be better,
okay,
and can make, progress in the battle.
Yeah, good. Well, progress is always good, and I think I want to start with a few perhaps more back to basic questions for listeners perhaps who aren't as familiar with the subject matter as you are. But how do you define addiction? Are there different types of addiction? I'm thinking sort of psychological addiction, physical addiction. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, so I have what is probably a minority view in the field of addiction. So most people in the field would define addiction as either a brain disease or some form of disorder. Essentially, dominant conceptualizations, dominant ways of thinking about addiction tend to, I would argue, medicalize and individualize the problem. So it's to greater or lesser extent, those accounts of addiction think that people become overpowered and to a greater or lesser extent lose control over their behavior. My take is slightly different to that. I don't think that addiction changes the fundamental basis of human behavior with respect to particular behaviors. And I actually think that addiction, to a large extent, is actually an explanation we as society use for undesirable behavior. So we tend to use addiction to explain problematic behavior, drug use, gambling, sex, things that people struggle with and have problems with. We don't, for example, evoke the concept of addiction when explaining behaviors that we like and approve of. So we wouldn't, for example, seriously refer to someone who practices playing the piano constantly as they are addicted to playing the piano. We would say they're dedicated to playing the piano.
Interesting, yeah, and I think that probably points towards a certain stigma as well. I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more. We often hear statements like I'm addicted to chocolate, or I'm addicted to YouTube reels, and with the explanation you gave, is everyone addicted in that sense to something, or is there a difference between habits and addictions? Can you talk to us a little bit more about kind of just the delineation of that, perhaps?
So, in my view, there is probably no substantive difference in, pursuing a behavior at the cost of others. That could be a positive behavior, it could be a negative behavior. I think we need to stop, pathologizing addictive behaviors. I need to start just conceptualizing as normal behaviors that, have adverse consequences. But, a lot of behaviors are dangerous. Human beings frequently do reckless and potentially dangerous behavior. They free climb, have unprotected sex, all sorts of things, but we don't tend to conceptualize them quite in the same way. And I actually think that conceptualizing addictive behaviors as sort of uncontrollable behaviors is potentially damaging, because essentially what we're doing is we're sort of telling people, don't start smoking, don't engage in X behavior, because you'll become addicted and you won't be able to stop. And we know from a lot of evidence that most people who suffer quite, serious addictions, as we call them, will at some point stop. And most people will stop, through their own volition. So I think it's unhelpful to persuade people initially to say, don't start, you're going to become addicted and you won't have control over your behavior, with the proviso that actually you can overcome it with sufficient willpower. So I think there's a contradiction in the concept of addiction, in that it conflates sort of free will, you can stop, and non-volitional, no free will explanations, you can't stop. Either you can stop or you can't stop. You can't be a little bit pregnant.
Right. Yeah. So from your point of view, and you explained it briefly at the beginning, that it's a case of in all or in most cases it can be overcome on your own volition without necessarily medicalizing it?
I think people can and do overcome addictions, and most people can and do overcome addictions with no support, or with support often, but through their own accord. They don't necessarily need to have therapy or medicine. Unassisted recovery is the norm in the field.
Okay. So
that doesn't mean to say that support doesn't play an important role in helping people overcome addiction, or in helping people who are affected by addiction.
Yeah. Okay. And if we look at the body and the brain, and what happens to the body and the brain when addiction develops and sort of takes hold, and is that different for adults versus the brains of children? How does that work, sort of from both a psychological and I guess a physical point of view?
Okay, so again, I've probably got a slightly different take to what you would hear from other experts in the field. So currently, neuroscientific explanations of addiction are the sort of dominant focus in the literature, and a lot of this work focuses on doing fMRI brain scans of people to sort of look at potential brain changes that happen as a function of engaging in addictive behaviors. And there are changes that take place in the brain. Some people think that the brain sort of gets hijacked. But I would argue that understanding what happens in the brain as a function of people taking substances, for example, doesn't allow us to sort of say people have no choice in whether or not they take substances. So just because we understand that the brain changes in response to all types of behaviors. If I go on a walk, that's going to be reflected in my brain. But just to sort of say, because your brain reacts to going on a walk, it doesn't allow me to say that I don't have a choice but to go on the walk. I think people have choices when it comes to making decisions with regards to substance use behaviors.
Yeah. And I suppose there may be some people listening who have struggled with addiction, who might be in recovery as well, who think that, well, that seems very difficult, a very difficult process. That kind of I've tried that before. In view of the definition of addiction that you mentioned there, how can it be overcome practically? If we look at really then the practical steps towards that, what path would be the right one to go down, both in society as well individually, to address that?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that, addiction problems are, essentially caused through interaction of different elements. So on the one hand, we've got, a famous sociologist in America called these influences drug, set, and setting. So we have the drug or activity itself and the pharmacological effects or psychopharmacological effects that has. We have the set, what we bring as an individual to the behavior in question, and we have the setting, the wider social context. My view is that our approach to tackling addiction have concentrated too much on the psychopharmacological aspect and the sort of individual aspects. And I actually think we as a society have more of a responsibility to support people who are struggling in particular aspects of their lives. So I would also say that, it's not necessarily easy to overcome addictive problems for pharmacological reasons, for psychological reasons, and for social reasons. I am in no way trying to downplay the effort and the difficulty it takes to overcome addiction.
Yeah.
I just think that at a fundamental level, and this is something that should give us all hope. There's lots and lots of people who have struggled with addictions, quite serious addictions, and at some point in their lives would have said, I can't stop. I can't change this behavior. It's overwhelming, But the beautiful thing, I suppose, about the human condition is, people, even in those seemingly hopeless decisions, most of those people will at some point overcome their addiction through a combination of willpower, through learning to lead a more balanced lifestyle, through reconfiguring how they think they are. So we know, for example, that a crucial aspect to overcoming addiction is to change how we think about ourselves, is to change our identity, change who we identify with, change what gives us meaning in our lives. So I think it's those kind of things, and they're not going to be easy, and they're going to take time, and people will fail. Relapse is the norm in the field as people recover from addiction. But what should keep us all going is that most people will succeed, and I believe that essentially people can always overcome addiction. Some don't manage for a variety of reasons, but the vast majority do. So I think that should give us all hope.
Yeah, indeed. And I think what you describe is very much, it seems like it's an individual approach. You mentioned the kind of individual. It's different for everybody. It's the same challenge, the same. It's ultimately addiction. But it is individual the way the approach happens. Is that
well? I was going to actually. Maybe I mischaracterized my thinking slightly. Well, I do think individuals obviously play a massive role. I think, for example, the organization I chair called Smart Recovery UK, we have a program that's specifically targeted at supporting friends and family who have individuals in their lives who are struggling with addiction problems. And one of the key things that program emphasizes is that actually to support others with recovery, you need to. The first step to that is actually being a bit counterintuitive, is to look out for yourself, is to, set boundaries and let go of the guilt that's associated with, say, your son or daughter struggling with addiction. And that sort of self-care will actually, I believe, facilitate individuals taking responsibility for their own recovery as well. So I think actually, addiction problems can be worsened by, social context, but they can also be made better by social context, friends and family.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, ultimately individuals have to change their behavior, but I think they can be supported in doing so quite effectively And organizations like Smart Recovery, mutual self-help groups, where people who have got similar issues meet regularly and just discuss their struggles. That can be a really valuable way of social support. Sort of emphasize that, look, we're not in this alone. There's other people going through the same issues. They have the same feelings of guilt and despair, but together we can give each other strength and overcome these behaviors.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the I suppose the people around you as well, family, friends, co-workers and so on. In terms of, in your opinion, what type of addiction is the most harmful, both in terms of health impact as well as, I suppose, impact on family and friends and co-workers? Is there such a thing that, one type of addiction is more harmful than another, or is it really all equal?
Well, I think at some level, all addictions have the potential to play havoc to individuals' lives and to the lives of, friends, family, and those around them. Somewhat counterintuitively, probably some of the legal types of addictions, such as addiction to alcohol, are probably more harmful than other types of addictions, and there's various reasons for that. So, for example, a lot of opioids. I mean, synthetic opioids can be very, very strong and maybe a different kettle of fish. But as a general rule, alcohol is probably a more harmful substance to the body than, for example, some other types of drugs that are more similar to, say, endorphins, like that we produce in our body ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think the type of substance plays a particular role on, how damaging it is to the body. And then often it's not necessarily the behavior that's necessarily damaging, but it's also the difficulty of, feeding an expensive habit, shall we say. So I think addiction problems are not just the sort of immediate health risks posed by, say, a substance. They're also concerned to do, if you want to sustain a serious heroin habit, most people will have to resort to crime or prostitution or something to be able to fund that. And that's a problem.
Yeah. And I suppose if we look at the financial aspect, gambling will be in there as well, I would have thought, right?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think it's slightly perverse that on the one hand, we've got, gambling platforms, raking in millions and millions and millions of pounds, whilst on the other hand, we have got literally livelihoods being destroyed through gambling. And I think this is, again, one of those areas where we as society, I think, need to take more responsibility for individuals affected. Gambling adverts, I think it's morally wrong for people to get tremendously rich on the misery of others. Yeah. So I think we as society need to step in and change the rules with regards to gambling advertising, and the industry needs to be much better regulated.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I recall about probably a year and a half ago, I was going through my social media feed, which I don't do very often, and there was a lot of gambling adverts there. And I don't know why they targeted me, but age group or I don't know, gender, whatever it is, how I was profiled, but it was there. So I sort of said, show less of this, the option that you have there. And it was instantly replaced with another gambling company's advert.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
And it just went deeper and deeper. And I did it, I counted, it must have been about 25, 30 times. And there was always another one to replace it. And it was incessant. I don't know whether that was just a stream specifically for the gambling advert category, or whether it was all advert categories, but just was full of gambling. I don't know, but it was just, there was more and more there all the time.
Well, imagine how, for you that was a mild annoyance, I would say. But imagine you're someone who's, had struggled with addiction problems, with gambling problems, and, was pursuing a recovery. To be constantly bombarded with adverts for gambling is, it's going to be more than a mild annoyance for those people. So I think we need to change our approach to that.
Absolutely. So I think many of us have a superficial awareness of the impact of addiction on the individual, but I just want to dive a little bit deeper, I suppose, into the topic, because I think there's a lot of we may not, well, a lot of things we may not be aware of as individuals, as lay people. You obviously know a lot more about this, but in speaking to people struggling with addiction, they shared with me that it's the stigma around addiction that prevents them from admitting they have a problem in the first place and seeking help. So how do we remove, I guess, as a society, the stigma around the word addiction, and removing that so actually folks can feel okay to ask for help in the first place? Because it sounds from people I've spoken to that is already a barrier to recovery, because they don't want to admit it, they don't want to ask for help because of the stigma surrounded by it. How do we approach that?
Well, I think there's a variety of things that have been happening in the field to sort of try and remove stigma associated with addiction. So we tend no longer to speak of alcoholics. We tend to use people with substance use disorders. So I think changing the language is a very important aspect to reducing stigmas associated with addiction. Addiction is one of the most stigmatized behaviors out there. More recently, there's been some calls to sort of try and differentiate between undesirable behavior and stigma. So at some level, I suppose, when a behavior is disapproved of by a society, socially disapproved society, that can also act as a sort of an impetus for people to change their behavior. If you, whenever you go out, you behave like, behave unsocially, and your friends start telling you, going to stop behaving in that way because it's not cool, So it's a fine balance that's supposed to be struck between society nudging people on to change their behavior for the better, whilst not stigmatizing the behavior at the same time. So I think, changing language, changing is one step in the right direction, I suppose. And my whole thing about sort of not thinking of addiction as this special disorder or disease might actually go some way. On the one hand, people argue, if addiction is a disease, then it's not people's fault, and how can you be stigmatized when it's not their fault? The problem with conceptualizing addiction as a disease over which people have no control is that, as I was arguing earlier, it sort of removes, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people start by believing that they are unable to change their behavior, despite us knowing that people regularly change their behavior, then that sort of undermines self-efficacy. And self-efficacy, people's belief in their ability to change behavior, is one of the best predictors of recovery from addiction. So I think we need to strike a balance between, not mystifying the behavior. We mystify addictive behaviors. Rather than talking about wants and desires, we talk about craving and withdrawal. And I think one way to destigmatize the behavior is also just to sort of conceptualize it in more normal language, as a behavior, as a behavior that we all encounter to varying degrees in many situations in our lives.
Yeah. So what I thought was really interesting, the way you summarized it just before, then saying by calling it a disease, you effectively are removing, and paraphrasing, so tell me if I'm wrong, by calling it a disease, you are removing effectively level of control, perceived control, from the person struggling with addiction, and saying, well, it is a disease, therefore it needs to be medically treated, and therefore it goes into the realm of, the medical treatment itself, which the individual can't control, and therefore they lose that level of control of actually influencing their own recovery in the first place. Is that am I understanding that right?
Yes, basically, I think how we think about a behavior, how we conceptualize behavior, dictates how we respond to it. So if we conceptualize a behavior as something beyond people's control because it's a disease, then people will respond to a greater or lesser extent to it in those terms. What's the point in trying? I've got a disease, that's not necessarily helpful. Yeah. I would argue.
Yeah. So I was talking to somebody that I know, and they shared with me that they struggled, just going back to the point that you just made about stigma, they struggled with opening up and asking for help before they reach the end of the path, before they hit rock bottom. Do you have any advice for people who are struggling with addiction on how they can better open up and ask for help before it's too late, before they lose everything? Is there any advice you can share on that one?
But I think one of the things that everyone should be aware is that a lot of people are going through these kinds of issues, and that support is out there. And that step in seeking support, going to Smart Recovery or other organizations, at any stage, often when people start realizing, oh, maybe there's something wrong with my particular behavior, it's probably better to seek support earlier than later. And I mean, the whole thing for Smart Recovery, at least, is it's about a balanced lifestyle. It's not necessarily, about people, never being able to drink another drop of alcohol. A lot of people will recover from their issues and develop more sensible strategies for drinking moderately, for example. So it's not an all or nothing solution either. I think sometimes if your favorite thing in the world is to drink alcohol, the prospect of never ever being able to touch another drop of alcohol will probably not induce you to go and seek support for your alcohol consumption. But the knowledge that, there's lots of different forms of recovery, I think is one way that can help. I think more widely, and this is an issue we have, as a society, we sort of other people with substance use behaviors. We think it's an individual problem. People have a disease or a disorder. It's their problem. And I think once we start to think of addiction as a more normal behavior, then that should hopefully also reduce the barrier that people experience to sort of confessing that they have this issue, that they have this disorder, because if we conceptualize addiction more as a normal behavior, then that should lower those barriers to actually acknowledging maybe I need to think about changing my behavior.
The answer you gave just before this question, actually, I'm just thinking about it, and I suppose on a societal and generational scale, we're actually seeing Gen Z looking at alcohol consumption very differently than, for example, Gen X. Where in the 90s and sort of early 2000s, there was very different kind of behavior around alcohol than there is now. And a lot of, for example, if you look at universities, student unions take a very different approach to, having bars or pubs on campus, for example, or even just individual behavior is very different. The approach and the view of alcohol is very different, with many young people not drinking at all because of, I'm assuming, what they've seen the previous generation do and how they behaved. And going back to your point about that's not cool, I think we're seeing that potentially play out. So I suppose it's there was a stigma that they perceived where they thought, yeah, that's not for me. Would you agree with that kind of trend and the kind of generational change?
Oh, definitely. I think when it comes to alcohol behaviors, at least, there's definite trend in many Western countries, in particular, that alcohol consumption has reduced quite dramatically, and there's potentially various reasons for that. I would say though that at the same time, that's probably one of the, we tend to often think, say for example, when we think about global warming or something, we think that, the future, the next generation is going to solve us, and they're going to think about it differently. Actually, interestingly, alcohol, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I suppose, are one of the few things where the next generation is actually quite different to us. In many ways, the next generation is more similar than different to us, which for other aspects of I don't think we can necessarily rely on younger people to reduce our reliance on carbon fuel, for example, fossil fuels, as a result. But yes, there's definitely a trend to less alcohol consumption, and I suppose a more health conscious approach to living amongst young people.
Yeah.
So again, I think this is a really nice example of how society can change. It's not inevitable that we live in a society where alcohol plays such a massive role in people's lives, and other ways of dealing with substances are possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're chair of the board at the charity called UK Smart Recovery. You mentioned it there before as well. What role do charities play in helping people to overcome their addiction? Can you tell us a little bit more about practically what UK Smart Recovery does?
Well, so UK Smart Recovery has sort of an approach to supporting people with addictions through regular mutual support meetings, and which has sort of 4 pillars, I suppose. The first pillar is of building and maintaining motivation, because to overcome a behavior, an ingrained behavior, it is difficult, as I was saying, and so you essentially have to stay motivated and have to keep on trying despite the inevitable knockbacks. It helps people cope with their urges and their strong feelings of wanting to undertake the behavior. And more generally, I suppose, teaches techniques for managing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to lead a more balanced lifestyle. And in many ways, I suppose, those kind of principles that guide smart recovery, they're useful for anyone, whether or not you have addiction problems or not. And one of the things our charity has recently started doing is we have developed specialist programs. So we've got a specialist program for veterans who disproportionately suffer from addiction issues, I suppose. But as I was saying earlier, we also support friends and family. And the whole key to that is that actually to be able to help someone with addiction problems, the first key is to help yourself, and to find some sense of normality again, and strength, and ways in which to support others that come from the come from a not a point in panic and not knowing what to do, actually just to ground yourself, and then in a more considerate way try and support others, loved ones with their behavior.
Yeah, I mean, clearly family and friends are incredibly important, and obviously if especially if they're aware, if somebody is struggling with that. Can you tell us a bit more how you see the kind of role of friends and family, and perhaps some practical do's and don'ts that they can or shouldn't do in trying to help?
I think practical do's and don'ts are, the first thing I suppose is that I think when a friend or family member develops problematic behaviors, addictions, that question of why and the guilt and the shame that is experienced, I think that's a normal response, I suppose. But the thing I think Smart does very well is to not, you've got to see through that shame and stigma wood, you can't see the trees for the wood, I suppose, and sort of overcome that, and to sort of get that balance in your life, set boundaries that you are comfortable with, those kind of things. The counterintuitive is, I think you need to look after yourself, because yes, another person might be, have real issues, but you will also have issues as a result of their behavior, and you need to get on top of your response before helping others.
Yeah. What else is needed to accelerate the path to reducing addiction in society? I mean, we've spoken about a lot of different aspects. Is there anything else? There's clearly never going to be a quick fix. There's not going to be, a one thing that will solve everything. But are there any other things that we haven't covered so far that make a positive long-term change to kind of the situation we're facing around addiction?
I think counterintuitively somewhat. So whilst individuals, have a disproportionate burden and affected quite dramatically often by, say alcohol problems or whatever, actually, if we sort of take a societal angle, then what we actually need to do is we need to reduce overall consumption for everyone. So it's not just those with addictive behaviors who need to drink less alcohol. It's everyone who needs to drink less alcohol actually, and we as a society, I suppose, need to develop a more sensible approach to these particular substances and behaviors. And as I was touching on earlier, that includes, we need to think carefully about whether or not we should allow gambling adverts to be done. We should think carefully about, whether it is right or sensible for alcohol to be as widely available and as cheap as it is. Those kind of macro level, we would call them, societal responses are something I think we need to pursue. I also think that at the sort of in sociology, I think it's called the meso level. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's the sort of group level. I think one other thing that I think there's a big potential is that that friendship groups, people's peers, can play a much more important role in supporting people to engage in more responsible forms of behavior. If someone's behaving out of order, we would often tell them that, but they shouldn't be. If someone's drinking too much, we as friends should be comfortable and sort of reining them in a little bit. So I think, again, if we take responsibility for our friends as much and take responsibility for ourselves, then that can play an important role in helping tackling addiction problems.
Yeah. It's interesting actually, that one, because it does remind me of my friendship group growing up when we were sort of 10, 11, 12 onwards, and there was a group of about 8 of us, and there was a very strong sense around smoking that anybody who even made any attempts to try and get a cigarette from somewhere was immediately shot down and said, why are you doing this? That's not who you are, and a very strong holding to account even at that age. And actually looking now at the same group of friends, none of them smoke. And it's
interesting.
It's carried through, but from a very, I don't know where that came from, whether it was just upbringing or whether it was somebody suggested it at some point and then one person said it and everybody else latched onto it. But that was a very strong sense very early on.
I think that makes a really nice point, actually, because we tend to, in the sort of substance use arena, we talk about peer pressure and, peers and groups being a bad influence. People lose their individual identity when they go out with others and start behaving in antisocial ways, engage in substance use and behaviors and all that kind of thing. Actually, there's a lot of evidence suggests that groups can do good, and that groups can actually encourage pro-social behaviors, can encourage sensible lifestyle choices. And I think they're an untapped resource, really, that we as society need to make better use of. That, all our behaviors occur within a social context, in a social setting. And I think my whole point is, if we individualize behaviors and only make them about the individual, we kind of lose the power that we have as a society within groups to facilitate behavior change.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
So I think groups can be a force for good, as they were in your case.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I still, I hadn't thought about it for a while, but I do think back to it, occasionally, and see the positive impact we had on each other. So that's very good. We're not quite done yet, but I just want to say I've learned a lot, and it's interesting to see your perspective and how you look at it, and even as you said, it's slightly different from perhaps the a sort of different approach that is perhaps more known and more adopted. But I think it's really interesting to kind of look at things in different ways, and I really appreciate you sharing what you shared, because I think there's a lot in there that I wasn't aware of, and I hope it's the same for our audience. But as I said, we're not done yet, because we do have the Virtually Anything Goes question, which is where you get to ask me a question rather than me asking you. I don't know what it is, so I'm not prepared for it, but I do have my safety net that you have to answer the same question after I've given my answer. So I'll hand the control over to you. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, many thanks for having me, and I enjoyed our little conversation. My question is as follows. So our eldest daughter is 18, finished school this year, is leaving home tomorrow. If you were me, what advice would you give her?
You've just catapulted me 10 years, 8 years forward, and I hadn't thought about that yet. Well, I would like to think that you have raised your children well, and that you will have instilled in them a sense of responsibility and instinct. And I would probably advise, in your position, or if I was in the same position, follow your instinct. When you're not unsure about what decision to make, look inside of you and follow your instinct before you make a decision, and whether it's the wise decision or not. I would like to think that I would be, this may be different in 8 years' time when my children are at a similar age, but I would like to think that I would be excited for them to explore, the sort of the new chapter in their life. And I know that I did at that age, and whether it's traveling or whether it's sharing, living quarters with somebody or whatever it might be, but I would like to think that I would be happy for them to go off and explore. But I think at the base of it, I think the instinct will give us a lot of guidance, and when raised well, which I'm sure your daughter is, I think that instinct will be very strong as long as she listens to it and follows that, because ultimately you will have instilled that responsibility into her. So I think if it's one point, I think I'd probably go with that. At least that's the one that quickest comes to mind.
Yeah, I like that, and I might adapt my own approach to tomorrow in light of what you've just said. My answer to the question, what advice I should be giving our daughter tomorrow when she leaves home, is to, firstly, I suppose, to make friends and to enjoy it. And then the other thing, I think, which I have learned, so our family has been touched by some unfortunate health issues over the years. And one of the things I've learned from that is actually that health, illness, death, that's the only thing, you can't do anything about. So I think another sort of guiding principle as young people, go out into the big bad world, is that, you can always change things in life and make different choices. You just have to be brave enough to do it. It's not always easy to make changes once you've gone down a particular path. But I think that knowledge that we can change things is probably something that, we'll see her through, hopefully, as she progresses into the next phase of her life.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And I like that answer as well. I think there's probably, when as parents, I think we will always have something in our minds where we think, these are the kind of principles we'll set our children off with into the big world. But I guess when it actually comes down to it, it's perhaps not always as straightforward as easy, or there's too much we want to say. But no, I like your answer. I think it's a good one, and I hope it goes well tomorrow, and it goes well for her in the next phase. I'm sure she'll have a lot of fun and enjoy the next stage of her life as well. So, Derek, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It's a big topic, and it's not an easy topic. So I appreciate you sharing your insights. I know that we probably haven't even touched on 2% of the overall subject matter, but it's nice to get an insight, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I hope if you're listening to this as a listener, that it was helpful for you as well, insightful. We will put into the description as well some links, certainly to UK Smart Recovery, some other links as well if you've been affected by any of the topics that we spoke about here today, where you can get some additional help as well. But if you liked this episode, if you think it would benefit somebody else, please share it. This information is here for us not just to create content, but just to help gain insights into areas that we perhaps don't always speak about. So share it with others. Subscribe to the podcast. There's other episodes on other topics from other experts, which I'm sure you'll find interesting as well. But for now, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe. And Derek, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate that.
Thank you again, Lev. Thank you.